All right, I think I am live. This is my first time actually going live on YouTube, but I'm also going live on Facebook. So let me just check right quick and make sure that it's showing up live on my Facebook because it should be live. It says live. Let me see. Oh, I think it's live. Let me check YouTube right quick, but I'm about to get started. Listen, this says, why are you making everything about race? And I thought about this because I don't think there's a better time to have that conversation with you all about race because there's no better time for you to have these conversations with your kids about race. Let me just check my sound real quick because I want to make sure I'm coming through loud and clear. Ooh, that girl coming through loud and clear on Facebook at least. Let me try YouTube. Let me try YouTube right quick because this is my first time ever going live on Facebook. I mean on YouTube. I don't even know if it's there. I don't even know where to find it. So we're just gonna keep going. I know it's live on Facebook and I can always get the recording. So let's go on and get into the conversation. Why should we have this conversation about race? Now, the thing is, um, folks are talking about it. Kids are talking about it, even if you're not talking to them about it. Kids learn about race earlier than we think. They learn about differences, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in terms of kids' development as well as what's happening in the world. And oftentimes, culture comes before race. They start learning about their culture even before they have vocabulary for race. And different races or different ethnicities tend to teach their kids about race at different times. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and take out this earpiece because I only put it in for the sake of checking my volume on my Facebook or whatever. But I want to make sure that I don't get a phone call that comes in and I get sidetracked. But this is the deal. If you're not having the conversation with your kids about race, somebody's having that conversation. And it doesn't, even if nobody that you know is having that conversation with them, they're picking up on cues around them. They're picking up on the social cues. They're going to learn about race and everything else at some point, right? Whether you teach them or not. And if you're the kind of parent that I think you are, that I am, that we all should strive to be, we want to be the ones that have that first level of influence because that's most important. Now, it's not about what's indoctrinating our kids or trying to persuade them a certain way, although that has been done in history. And if you don't know, I am not just your parenting BFF, but I'm also an educator. I double majored in history and political science. This is my jam. I've been studying this my entire life. Career wise, I was a teacher. I was a U.S. history teacher, government and econ, in addition to elementary and middle school, right? So I've always taught kids of all different ages. Not only that, I have two children who are 30 and 31 years old. I have four grandchildren. So that cycle has never stopped for me in terms of being around kids of different ages. My grandson is six. My oldest one is 6 years old now. He's going through some of these same things. He's at a school where he's one of very few Black people, right? So they're gonna notice differences. And listen, let me just set the record straight up front. It's not about blaming people. It's not about politics. This is about child development. It's about our leadership as parents and leading our household correctly. So let's go ahead and get into it. You're going to see me peeking back at my notes because I don't want to miss anything. But sometimes people tend to think about if they talk about race, are they indoctrinating their kids? Are they putting some biases on their kids? Well, let's be clear about what indoctrination is. It's repeating the messaging of something without questioning it. And we can indoctrinate. Kids are going to learn about race, whether you teach them or not. They don't have to have the formal lessons in order to learn on how people behave around people of certain ethnicities or backgrounds. If you're walking with your kid, most people just finished Christmas shopping, right? If someone were walking with their kid in Christmas shopping and they saw a Black person and they clutched their purse, kid is picking up on that. They're noticing it, whether they say something about it or not. Now, the trip is my grandson, he says something most of the time. He's going to repeat what he just heard you say, right? Especially if it's something he hasn't heard before. He's going to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until he figures out what it means, right? And so you have to know that kids are always learning. They learn more from observation than they do from education. They're going to learn more from what you do and your behavior than they do from what you say. But guess what? It's still important that you say something. It's important that you teach them what you're already teaching them, right? What you intend for them to learn, because your silence teaches them also. Your silence is teaching them way more than your voice is ever going to teach them, right? If you lean into race is something we don't talk about, guess what? That's going to make them more curious about it. So it's time you have the conversation. And let's talk about timelines, right? In terms of child development, from 0 to 3 years old, kids are just noticing differences. They're picking up on patterns in the world around them. They're looking at everybody in my house has this skin tone, but when I go outside the house, the kids have this skin tone, or these kids have that skin. They're just noticing the differences, right? They don't have a name for it yet. They don't have any biases associated with that. They don't have any judgment on what's good or bad yet, but they notice the difference. And then they also notice the difference in people's behavior towards people with differences, right? They start to then categorize between the ages of 3 and 5. They start to categorize people. They start to notice boy versus girl. They start to notice like big and small. They start to notice these categories and patterns. They have a label for some of them. They may notice your skin's not the same color as my skin, although they may not have a knowledge of race at this time, right? But then from 5 to 8, they start to make meaning of those things. I remember when I taught first grade and I was in a predominantly Latino school. In that year, I had one Black kid and the rest were Latino. And I had this one kid I'll never forget. And she said, I don't like Black people. Now, let me preface this. She was a Latina, but she was a brown skinned Latina, and we had the same complexion. We were the same complexion. So I don't think she knew that I was Black because I looked just like her, right? And so she said, I don't like Black people. And I said, why? Why don't you like Black people? She said, because my mom doesn't like Black people. I said, why doesn't your mom like Black people? Because now this is getting interesting, right? And so she said, my mom had a bad experience with a Black person. She doesn't like Black people, and I don't like Black people. But she loved me. She just didn't know I was Black. And she may not have known anybody was Black. She may not have known what that term meant, but she might have picked up on a conversation her mom had with somebody else and said, I don't like Black people because XYZ happened, right? But this kid who's 6 years old, who's in first grade, who heard that is like, I don't like Black people because my mom doesn't like Black people. Wow. Now they're starting to make meaning, right? 5 to 6 years old. And now from 8 to 12 and beyond, they start to figure out what's fair. They notice in school, for example, when one kid is getting sent to the office, or one kid is being told repeatedly, sit down, stop doing this, stop doing that, like you're on their back, when a teacher is on a kid's back. Now, I know some of y'all parents that's old school like me. I'm 50. Many people are probably like, well, that kid need to sit down. Well, he need to be quiet. Well, the problem is that sometimes kids of other backgrounds are also doing the same thing, oftentimes doing the same behaviors. But if the only kid that gets called on or called out for their behavior is the Black kid in the class, now it looks like that kid is the bad kid, right? And kids pick up on that. And they're like, this kid is always in trouble. They notice those differences. And they might notice if it's fair or not. They might notice if one person's being treated differently than other people are being treated. I have some friends who have siblings, and some of them have said, I was the darker skinned kid. And I always noticed how my sibling, who looks just like me but is lighter skinned with longer, wavier hair, how she was the favorite. Everybody said that she was beautiful, but they never called me beautiful because I was darker skinned, right? Kids learn those things about differences and whether or not it's fair, what the system is like, who is a certain way with certain people, right? They notice these things. And whether they verbalize them or not, they internalize them. Whoa. Now, that's huge. And that wasn't even in my notes. But this is the truth. They internalize for themselves based on how they identify, right? If you say something about Black people and I realize I'm a Black person, I can internalize. Or if you say, dark, oh, this person is darker skinned and they're not cute, or this person is fat and they're not cute, whatever labels you place on somebody, they start to internalize, and either they're going to fight against it or they're going to accept it. And either way, we put people in a bad situation, right? Now, let's talk about race versus culture because these are not the same. Oftentimes, we use them as if they're the same. And I'm just checking to see if there's any quotes or comments yet. I don't see any, but we use race and culture like they're the same when they're not. Race and culture are two different things. Culture is how we live out certain things. Race is mostly skin deep, right? But for example, religions, language, music, arts, food, all of that is a part of the culture. And I'm making this distinction because I'm going to talk about at what age families introduce their kids to culture based on race, right? But culture is about belonging to a specific group. Race is how society responds to your culture. Race is how society looks at you based on your skin tone, usually, or your language, or the foods that you eat. I remember watching a video. It was this guy who was probably African. He looked like he was African, and he was talking about what he eats. He eats one meal a day. He's fully muscular, really nice, defined muscles, all of that, six pack. And he was showing what he ate. And he had like two big pieces of salmon and like five boiled eggs and like all this vegetables, all this stuff laid out. And he was taking the salmon by hand and just eating it. And somebody in the comments was talking about, oh, he just gonna eat that with his hands, right? Culture, right? It's a cultural thing, but people place a value on that culture based on whether or not it's the same as their culture or if it's different, right? And so race now is how society responds to the culture. Kids experience the culture first before they even know about race. Enters the conversation when your culture is now being judged, when somebody has an opinion about your culture. Now, let's break it down community by community. And of course, I'm going to start with Black people because that's who I am, right? So, Black people, we tend to talk about culture. First of all, our race and culture are oftentimes intertwined. And I'm speaking specifically about Black American people because as we came here during slavery, most people who came here during slavery and the international slave trade, our culture and our race were intertwined. There was a period, just to briefly go into history, when there was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. He was an indentured servant. He led a group of indentured servants and slaves to fight against the people who owned the land, right? And because of that, he was a white person who was an indentured servant. But he and Black people fought together to try to get their rights and things like that. And because of that, at that point, once that rebellion was squashed, they decided that Blacks will be slaves for life, not slaves for a period of time. And they went ahead and gave whites basically their indentured servitude was already on a contract of a certain number of years, and then they were supposed to get their freedom and some land and all these things, right? Which is what led to the rebellion because they weren't getting their land, they weren't getting free at the time they were supposed to. But because they could easily, it was hard to differentiate between who was supposed to be working and who wasn't, right? When you have Black and whites both doing the same work. And so they said, okay, Blacks, we're going to make these Africans slaves for life. So for us, oftentimes that was about our race and our culture got intertwined because you had so many people that were brought here from Africa and maybe from different parts of Africa that had different languages. They might have had different foods. They might have had different religions and practices. But then being brought here to America and being made American slaves, now it's all intertwined because now we're all one, right? And we're just struggling to survive. Well, those conversations about race with our children oftentimes need to happen early on. Why? For a number of reasons. Number one, there's the pride of it, right? We have Black History Month. Next month, we'll be celebrating MLK Day. have a special announcement for MLK Day, not today, but probably I'm aiming for January 1st, so stay tuned for that. But there's that. I remember that when I was in kindergarten, I played Harriet Tubman in a school play, and that set the stage for me. That that is what caused me to end up studying history, double majoring in history and political science from kindergarten. My mom and I took the encyclopedias. We had two sets of encyclopedias at home. Ooh, oh, let me take note to that those encyclopedias because I got something else to talk about that on a different note. But specifically, we looked in those encyclopedias to see what Harriet Tubman was like, what she looked like, how she dressed, all those things, and then I dressed and played the part, right? And then from there, I read every book I came across dealing with Harriet Tubman. All right. So conversations start earlier on in life. You know, I believe in that same school play. Somebody played Martin Luther King Jr. Somebody played Rosa Parks, right? We start to learn about these things, but also it's a matter of safety. I'm pausing on purpose. It's a matter of safety. How many people have had to have conversations with their kids about what happens when you get stopped by the police? And how many of us have seen videos of kids at younger and younger ages being handcuffed by police, slammed on the ground, preteens even? We see it. Look at Tamir Rice being gunned down by the police, right? Killed, murdered. And so we have to have those conversations earlier and earlier. It wasn't a matter of Tamir Rice resisting arrest. People want to say stuff like, oh, well, you know, this person shouldn't have resisted or that person shouldn't have resisted. This kid was playing in the park with a toy gun, right? And was killed. So we have to have those conversations for safety reasons. We have to talk about race. And kids are going to be exposed to it anyway. Kids are oftentimes, every single Black person I know can tell you the first time they were called the N word. Again, I'm pausing on purpose. Every single one of us can tell you the first time they were called the N word. They can tell you the first time they felt discriminated against, the first time they felt like their race caused a level of discrimination, whether they were called the N word in that situation or not, right? Every single one of us has a story. And unfortunately, we probably all experienced it in some way or another. But we have to have those conversations with our kids because of safety and because we love them. Right. But for Black kids between ages 0 and 3 years old, culture becomes apparent. Their appearance becomes apparent, right? They start to notice what's different. They start to notice some things about their culture, right? They start to learn about the things that they're eating. And between 3 to 5, they can name the difference. They can say, oh, this person is dark skinned or this person is lighter skinned, right? They can start to learn those differences, but then the biases become aware between 5 and 7 years old. Now, I'm telling you, this is the sweet spot for babies. These babies at 5 years old, they just want to belong. They just want to know that somebody loves them. You know, I think about when I taught kindergarten, my first year teaching back in 2006. I was in Linwood Unified School District at that time. My class was, I had all Latinos, 100%. The class next door to me had one Black kid, one white kid. Of all kindergarten, 100 kids, it was one Black kid, one white kid, and the rest were Latinos, right? Some spoke English at home. Some of them spoke Spanish at home. It was, it was split. But the kids noticed the difference. Kids noticed differences. And I remember, some kids had the language to be able to say, oh, I speak Spanish at home or I speak English at home, and some kids didn't have that. Some kids were in the beginning of the school year, they would come up to me and just start speaking to me in Spanish. And I didn't understand them, right? But because I didn't understand them, they stopped talking to me in Spanish. And I just, like, one little girl, oh my goodness, I wish I were able to check on these babies because I remember this one so clear, and I'm intentionally not naming names, but this one baby, she would come up to me and talk to me in Spanish, and she would speak so fast, and I'm like, slow down, because yo hablo español poquito, right? But slow motion. You have to talk to me slowly. And I'm going to pick up some of the words, right? But also because she was 5, her level of language was a little different from what I had learned in formal Spanish education, right? But, anyways, those biases start to show up. People are starting to learn differences. Kids between 5 and 7, they're learning those differences. They're learning this kid is always in trouble. They're learning some of those things. And at 8 and up, they start to have these real racism conversations. And if they're not having them with you, they're having them with somebody. And so I want to encourage you to be the person that's having those conversations with your kids. Now, these conversations are not about you just putting your biases on your kid, but it is about survival. It is about them being able to tell you that this different thing is happening, what's happening between them and other kids who may look different from them. They need to be able to talk to you about what's going on. And I didn't have those issues because I was in predominantly Black schools growing up my whole life. So I didn't have that situation where I was the only Black kid, But when when I went to college, when I went to USC, sometimes I was the only Black person in the class. When I started with Teach for America, there were times that I was the only Black person around, right? And so I got into these different areas, and that's when I started to experience some things very differently, right? Now, let's look at how white people deal with culture in their families. Now, I'm going to be honest with y'all. I got a lot of this information, this part from ChatGPT, because I was like, listen, I can't speak on what other races do. I can speak on what I know from my own experiences, and I can't really speak thoroughly on other people's experiences, but I'm going to tell y'all what chat says. They said that the race conversations are usually delayed, and white culture is seen as normal, right? That's the neutral. This is the starting point. So you get mad at me if you want to. Get mad at Thurgood, because Thurgood is my chat GPT. Hold on right quick. So their culture is seen as normal. Theirs is the tradition. This is the standard. When you see American something, now, when you see American, they're usually talking about white Americans. They're usually not talking about Black Americans, Latinos, or Asians, because they will give you that qualifier. They will say Asian Americans, they will say African Americans, they will say Latino Americans, Latin Americans. They will not just say Americans when speaking about people who are non-white, usually. Now, on the rare occasion that you see it, you might, but that culture is seen as the basic, right? That's seen the norm. That's the standard. Unfortunately, but that's how we do things here in America, right? Now, white parents may not label their traditions. They may not say this is white tradition. They won't say that, right? They won't say these are white values or this is white history. They won't say that, right? Because theirs is considered the norm. That's the basic and that's the regular, and everything else stems out of that. But that's just, they see things as just how they are. This is just how they are. Now, what's interesting is there was a period of time in the US when whites were not the majority. Native Americans were. Still, in the way they see and operate, they still operated as if they were the norm. They were the standard. I remember looking at when I was studying history and teaching history, we were looking at how slaves outnumbered the slave masters, right? They outnumbered them. However, the standard was still white Americans, right? And for them, it's not about culture, it's not about race, it's just this is the way it is. This is just how things are. And one of the things that is very interesting is that I found that race conversations are delayed amongst white people. They would prefer to preserve their kids' innocence, right? They're like, why do we have to keep talking about race? Why do we have to have those conversations? And a lot of people will say stuff like, I don't see race, but they don't understand that that's a privilege. It is a privilege to not see race, right? Because most of us do see race. We don't have an option. We don't have a choice. We go into a job interview, we know that we nailed it, we don't get the job. We have to wonder, is it because I was Black? But white people don't usually have to go into an institution interview, come out, nail it. They can come out thinking like, what was the other myriad of things it could be? But most of the time, they're not thinking, did I not get this because I'm white? Unless a black person gets the job, then they're like, oh, affirmative action, DEI, all of those things. And I wasn't trying to be political, but I am going to tell my experiences, right? For kids, for white kids, a lot of times parents want to just keep their innocence. They don't want them to have to think about race. It's interesting that Vice President J.D. Vance said that white people no longer have to apologize for being white. I don't know a single white person who's ever had to apologize for being white. That's just a very interesting statement. And I don't expect anybody to apologize for being white. One of the things that I remember having this conversation with my students when I taught 11th grade US history and 12th grade government econ in California, I remember telling my students, I said, you never blame anybody today for what their ancestors may have done, because none of us want to be blamed for what our ancestors have done, right? None of us even want to be accountable for what our parents have done. And so that's not fair to blame anybody for something that their ancestors have done. But when you see those same behaviors in the people today that were the same behaviors that their ancestors did, then you can fault them for that. Then you can hold them accountable for that, right? And so when you delay those conversations with your kids, it doesn't mean that they stop learning about race. They just learn it from someplace else. They learn it through observation. Number one, they're going to see what you turn your nose up to. Like, you got to see a lot of racism come out of people during Super Bowl last year, right? And especially when they named Super Bowl this year. They try to push these narratives about, oh, so many people turned off the TV after the Kendrick Lamar performance because they didn't like his performance. Well, that's an assumption. Some of us turned the TV off because Kendrick said, turn the TV off, right? That's what it was a directive, right? And we turned the TV off. But you can tell by the people in the crowd that people love that performance. People on their feet, they're singing along. I mean, the energy, what? But the narrative for people who believe differently took the conversation in a different way. Well, don't you think kids were watching that? Kids are watching that. When it was announced that Bad Bunny is going to do this Super Bowl coming up in 2026, you don't think kids watched parents' reactions to that? Oh, they did, right? And they're learning how to judge people based on your reactions to things. They're picking up on the conversations, whether they say something or not, right? So the kids are going to learn regardless. And so, I remember hearing people say stuff like, well, I don't see color. You see color. You see color. Even people who are literally colorblind, who have a defect to where they are colorblind, they see Black versus white versus Asian versus Latino versus Native. They see it. Now, whether you discriminate against a person because of it is a different conversation. But to say I don't see color, I can't even believe anything else you say after you say that, right? And then people will use phrasing like, oh, we're all the same and just be kind. And I'm talking about the white people who are not racist, right? And I know that people mean well. They don't mean to be offensive. But to say I don't see color shows that you don't see me as the individual that I am, as a different person, right? And those kids oftentimes struggle to explain like inequality. Those families, they have a hard time explaining to their kids about differences, about injustices. They see it. They're going to see it. It's on the news. They can be watching YouTube Kids, and guess what? It's something that's probably going to pop up on their iPad, something that's probably going to pop up on their phone. There's going to be the information there. If you don't have the conversation with the kids are going to have the conversation somehow, right? Now let's look at Latino families. Many Latino families socialize in culture very early. And from what I've heard, like they are the most, the subgroup that talks to their kids earlier about earliest, I'm going to say, about culture. Now, it's Language is speaking to their kids, is speaking to them in the womb still, but it's culture all around them. It's culture everywhere, right? And of course, the different Latino groups that do things differently all over the diaspora, but there are some staples that whatever their tradition is, they're going to teach it to their kids, right? They're going to speak the language to their kids. They're going to, the music, the food, the religion is always right there. It's always there, right? And I have not seen any that wasn't. And then there's also this strong extended family presence. There's multi generational living situations, right? You'll have the parents, the kids, the parents, the grandparents, the great grandparents, all in the same household, right? And they're building that is cultural, right? Yeah, it may help financially as well, but the main thing is about that culture, and it's a beautiful thing to see, right? Children learn very early on who they belong to, how their family operates, who's in charge. Respect is high. The cultural norms are high. It's about those family roles. They absolutely take on those roles. I remember talking to one of my friends who was a teacher with me in Sacramento, and she said if she were still in Mexico, she probably would have gotten married young as a teenager, right? And she would have had a bunch of kids. At this point, she was probably like 30 or so, unmarried, no kids, living her best life. But she was like, if I were still in Mexico, I would have got married young. I wouldn't have got a bachelor's degree. I wouldn't be a teacher right now. I wouldn't be purchasing my own home right now, right? All of the things that she has said, it would have been a very different lifestyle for her if she had stayed in Mexico, right? Because the culture is that strong. Now, the trip is that race usually enters the conversation for Latino families through the school and school systems. What? What? Through the school and the school systems. When kids come to school and they're taught to speak English, not just taught, but told, like, how come you don't speak English, in a very negative way. People are doing it now. Like up until 2025, there was no national language here in the United States. But you would still hear people say stuff like, "Oh, if you come here, you need to speak English." You know, I always hated that. I was like, there's no national language. I think Donald Trump signed a executive order or something requiring English to be the language or something like that, but it's not in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say we have a national language. Let's be clear. And then kids are learning about culture and race so much more right now because because of this whole ICE situation, because of Donald Trump's, and I didn't mean for this to be political, but because of his campaign and his focus on getting rid of undocumented immigrants, right? They've specifically targeted Latinos in a number of areas because they're like, oh, if they have a certain accent with their English or if they don't speak English, they're most likely undocumented, which is crazy to me because I know some citizens who still have heavy accents from wherever they're from, right? My best friend, since third grade, her family is from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. Well, many of them are US citizens, but they still have the accent. My stepfather's from Belize. He still has the accent, and so these are, and those are Latino, those are Latin American countries, to be politically correct, it is. But when you have people, these conversations about immigration and citizenship are coming up, and so kids are learning about them at a much earlier age. And at sometimes when it's not developmentally appropriate for them to be having these conversations, but because the level of fear in America right now is so high, they don't have a choice but to have those conversations now, right? And when race shows up and their culture is treated as a problem, we're doing so much harm right now. We're doing so much harm. And I know so many people don't care that harm is being done because they feel like, well, it's your family's fault for, coming here illegally or whatever. And I disagree, but I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm sure we will have a conversation about this in one time. But just suffice it to say, these are kids being exposed kids being exposed to issues of race and culture because of ICE and because of ICE raids that are happening is not, it's not emotionally safe for kids, and I don't like it. Um, so also, unfortunately, the question of what are you or where are you from, those are the questions that kids end up being asked. And I remember I was at a casino, and there was a Latino guy at the table, and there was a white lady at the table, and it was me and the dealer. And so she asked him, "Where you from?" He said, "Nebraska." She was like, "No, you're not. Where you really from?" And I almost lost it. I had to hold it together. I wish I would have lost it because I was like, and he might have been Asian. I don't even remember if he was Latino or Asian. But the reality that she and I would and I what I wanted to say, I'm working on being a nicer person. So I didn't lose it the way I feel like I should have, because later on I was like, I should have just let her have it. I should have called her all the names that I wanted to call her. Because the reality is, first of all, you don't need to know where he's from. It ain't even none of your business where he's from. But he said he's from Nebraska. Just like if you said you were from Nebraska, right? Just like if I said I'm from Nebraska, you would have accepted it if I had said I was from Nebraska, but because he identifies differently, you don't want to accept that as the answer. That's a problem to me, right? And I wish I would have stood up for him. And he ended up saying wherever he was from, and I don't remember right now because now I'm all hype about it. But I wish I had stood up for him the way I should have, right? I don't know why my nose is running, y'all, but it's running. I'm trying to keep it clean and not be over here sniffing on this recording, on this live. But Asian and Pacific Islanders, these families, race is often not discussed until something happens. But when it does, it's often seen as something to manage, not something to confront, right? It's like, oh, like let's manage this situation. And culture and those expectations, they tend to form early on, but it's usually when a kid has experienced something. And it's unfortunate that we see people who are different, of different backgrounds, of different cultures, different languages, that we want to point that out. Kids, I'm not we as in me, but we as in kid in American society. Kids in school will point that out. You look different. Your food looks different, right? They're going to point that out. They're going to say something about it. Education is usually important in the Asian Pacific Islander community, and I'm not saying that as opposed to it not being important in other cultures. I'm just, that's one of the things that is highly regarded. Respect for their elders is highly regarded. Discipline and responsibility are highly regarded, right? You'll see when I talk about education, like there's, and it's understandable because in a lot of these cultures, countries that they come from, that these cultures come from, that's the standard. I remember reading a book, and I can't remember the name of the book, but they had taken an exchange student from South Korea and exchanged him, brought him to the U.S., and took a American student and sent him to South Korea. Well, in their culture, what they do is they go to school and then they hire a tutor after school, and they stay up until like midnight with the tutor, sometimes past then, because the way they test and the jobs that you qualify for based on your testing, right? So they have to make sure that they get the best test scores. They say that in India, they have more honor students than we have students in America, right? So it's a much higher standard for them to get the quality education that they need in order to be able to excel in life, because there's so much more competition there. But the trip is that we're all competing for the same positions in colleges, and we're all competing for the same jobs, right? So education, academics, that is of highest concern. And that's why you have um, that focus more than you have on like sports, I would say. And I don't even know if that's a true statement data wise, but just visually, when I look at the number of like basketball players from these Asian countries in the NBA, when I look at the US in the Olympics playing against these other countries, um, it's usually not. And I don't know, because you know what, when I think about the people that I've seen in the schools that I've worked at and those games that I've gone to, you have some of these Asians that, I mean, they play ball, right? They got it. So no telling, but you do see those academics, high academics as well. Their focus is more on assimilation for safety reasons. A lot of times you can talk on the phone to a person who's Asian and they sound just like any other American white person, right? You don't always have that distinction of this person sounds like an Asian person, right? Because there's that focus on assimilation, there's that focus on get your language together, have the standard American English accent, etc., right? And their goal is to avoid conflict, to avoid attention, just assimilate into the culture, seem like everybody else, right? Blend in and don't stand out. And so race usually oftentimes enters their conversation again with their kids, and hearing stuff like, where are you really from? Like the ignorance that comes through people who don't understand. And you can simply ask, if you, first of all, again, I want to repeat, you don't always have to know the answers to these questions, right? But if you want to know, there's a respectful way to ask. And so I will ask sometimes, like, what's your heritage? And I ask that only because, not to discriminate against people, but because I love culture like I do. I study history. This is my jam. I love I've been to 28 countries because I love to learn about other cultures, right? So it's a different energy on it. And I think people can feel the energy behind why you're asking things. Now, there is the stereotypes that Asians have about being the model minority. And I remember hearing somebody complain about that. And I was like, what are you complaining about? Like, it's one thing to be having the stereotype of being a thug or a gang member or a drug dealer, etc., but you're the stereotype of the model minority. How does that hurt you, right? But it hurts when you don't fit in. It hurts when you don't fit the stereotype. Like for us, it hurts when you do fit the stereotype, or it hurts because you don't, but people think you do. I guess it's the same, really. If somebody thinks I'm a thug and I'm really not, that can be hurtful. But if somebody thinks I should be excelling at a high level and I'm struggling, it's hurtful in a different way. It hurts in a different way because it's magnifying the fact that I don't fit that stereotype, right? And I remember, oh my gosh, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Hassan Minhaj. I'm trying my best. Um, of course, I prefer to say Hassan Minaj. That's how I say it, but I don't think that's how he says it. So I try to say it the way he says it. But he's Indian American. And, hearing him talk about certain things like these very same conversations, he faces race head on. He talks about, every, Indian parent wants their kid to be a doctor, really a doctor. I don't even think the lawyer is on the table. I don't think that's the thing that they really are wanting their kid to be, but doctor. And he's a comedian, he does very well and probably makes more than any doctor I know. But, that is the expectation that they have, which is not a bad expectation to have, but I can see how it could be hurtful if somebody doesn't fit that. Now, for them, their silence, they feel is their protection. They feel like we'll just be quiet about the problems we may face and it'll go away, right? That's their survival tool. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Native Americans. And I honestly felt like I had to start with my culture and then save the best for last on the other end, because Native Americans, of course, I'm part Native, like most Black people are here in America, and for a myriad of reasons, right? But culture is very prominent in Native American and Indigenous families, right? And is not as much within themselves as like race and skin tone. I haven't heard about colorism among Native peoples, but it probably exists because you have some people who are Native who look like they are white presenting, right? And so that could be a challenge. But their thing, race is inseparable from their loss, their survival, right? For those who know, like Native Americans, when you think about it in terms of this, Native Americans encompass this entire country. And now many of them are on little reservations here and there, sprinkled around the country, right? They had all of the land at one point. Now they have pockets of land, right? And it's not the best land. It's not the most fruitful land. It's not the most I can't even think of the word I was thinking about. It's not the land that fertile. It's not the most fertile land, right? Because that land was taken away from them. And so now it is about survival. That culture, it is about hanging on as much as they possibly can to their culture because land is continually being taken from them or being used in a way that they don't approve of, right? And it's not okay because this was all their land. And once upon a time ago, there was a promise that these settlers would not go past the Appalachian Mountains. Well, I live in Nevada. We are past the Appalachian Mountains, right? And so, anyways, this was previous, and I'm trying not to be political, but I guess I have to be because this is who I am, right? But culture as survival, the languages that they held, their ceremonial practices, their stories are all acts of resistance. You know, I have a friend who is native and she just recently went back to the reservation and she posted a bunch of pictures. And I was like, for sure, I want to listen to her tell her stories, right? Because there's so much that you can learn from that. And their culture is taught more through living and experiences, less about the lectures, but more about we're going to live and have this experience. I remember my second year teaching. I went from teaching kindergarten at one school to teaching fifth grade at another school because there was low enrollment, all that stuff. But one of my fifth graders was full blood Native American. He had this sweater that said full blood on the chest and full blood on the sleeves, right? And he would go dance in these powwows and things like that. And it's so amazing to see the culture, right? He was in fifth grade, so he was what, 11 years old or so, or 12 maybe, and getting to learn more about his culture in that way through powwows and stuff like that. And of course, not all Native Americans fully participate or are active like that, but it was so good to see that he was and very proud of that. Now, I was still in that same district that was primarily Latino, but in that class I had one Asian kid, one mixed black and white kid, one Native American, one black kid, and the rest were all Latino out of 36 kids, right? So you had this sprinkling of diversity in that one class, and it was so good to see. And I was so glad that I was honored to be able to be their teacher. Um, but again, for them, for Native Americans, it's about community. It's about their land. It's about, celebrating their elders. And I absolutely love it. It's about people first. And that's a part of their identity is in putting people first. Their tribal identity matters more than racial categories. But when you see a people who are so focused on community and land and their culture and their identity, and you see a government that's really trying to do as much as it can to break that up and take from that land, it is hurtful to see. And it's not even, I have a lot of empathy for that, even though it's not me personally, right? Um, and a lot of their history is missing and is not taught in classes. You'll get a brief blurb about Native American history. Oftentimes in most history classes, it's not taught a whole lot. But there are movements to reclaim their own stories, reclaim their own history, and to show that they are here. Native Americans have fought in every war that Americans have been in. Native Americans, the Navajo Indians were, I even hate saying the word Indian, but the Navajos were instrumental in helping America win World War II, right? Instrumental. So it's very important to keep that history up. So let's get back to, kids are learning about history at a very about their history, about their culture, about their ethnicity at a very early age. In their development, they are learning how to interact with people who are different. I was thinking about, there's a book. I don't know how long I've been on here, but there's a book that I read as a teacher. It was called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, right? And culturally responsive teaching and the brain. Hey, too many stories. I don't know if there's such a thing as too many stories. Or you have too many. So I don't know what Chris meant by that. I do get to see the comments. I didn't look at them earlier, but in the book Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, they talk about how when you have a student who may be a Black student and they have a white teacher, the way they communicate may be different, right? And they said they gave this example where you have the white teacher who the kid might be in line to sharpen their pencil, the bell rings, and the teacher says, "Hey, Johnny, do you want to sit down now and sharpen your pencil later?" And Johnny says, "No, I want to sharpen my pencil now." They go ahead and sharpen their pencil, right? Now the teacher feels disrespected because they meant to communicate that I want you to sit down and sharpen your pencil later, right? But they didn't say it that way. They said, "Do you want to?" Which for us sounds like it's optional. To me, it sounds optional, right? What she meant to communicate was, "I want you to sit down right now and you can sharpen your pencil in a few minutes." That's not what she communicated. And I remember as an adult having that same exact experience to where I was a principal at a school, and the head of IT said to me, "Hey, Kalisha, if you have your teachers send me um, their newsletters, I'll post them on the website." I said, "Okay." And I talked to all my teachers, and they were like, "We don't need her to post them on the website. We send them home to our parents, a physical copy. We send them home an email, so they get them. Like, we don't need her to post them on the website." Okay, cool, no problem. Then she comes back later on, the head of IT, and it's like, "I told you to have your teachers send me their newsletters, and you never did." And I said, "What? You absolutely did not tell me to have my teachers send you their newsletters. You said if they send you the newsletters, you'll post them on the website. If sounds like optional, right?" There was just a miscommunication, and probably based on race and upbringing and things like that. Because I'm like, if it was mandatory, you should have said, "Hey, we need everybody's newsletter so we can post them on the website because this is what we want to do. We want to post everybody's newsletter on the website." Well, that's not what you said, right? And so now there's this miscommunication, and one person is putting a value judgment on the other person. Well, let me say, this person was putting a judgment on me and who I was as a person and as a leader based on her misunderstanding of how she was communicating, right? So, race, culture, these conversations will always come up, right? We're always going to put people in a category. People like to say, use the word judgment a lot. Well, we're always judging. Even if we say something is good, we're judging. We always judging if something is good or bad, right? It's always a judgment. So, anyways, the conversations start very early with kids of different cultures. They start earlier, but if you don't have that conversation at all, you're behind the ball. If your kid starts kindergarten and sometimes even preschool, and you haven't had a talk with them about race, you're probably behind because they're going to have the conversations at school. And they may come home and talk to you about it, and they may not. If your kid is anything like my grandson, my 6-year-old Sincere, he's going to come home from school and say, "What did you learn today?" "I don't know." And it's funny. It's not funny because I don't like it when he says that. I'm like, or he'll say nothing. "What, you didn't learn anything? You were at school all day. You learned nothing?" And then I told him, I said, "Every day when I pick you up, which is not often, you better know something that you learned today." Right. And so I remember the last time I picked him up, I said, "What'd you learn at school today?" He said, "My ABCs and 1, 2, 3s." I said, "What?" At 5, I think he was 5 at the time, 5 or 6 years old. You learning your ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. You knew your ABCs and 1, 2, 3s before you started school. Quit playing with me, right? But honestly, kids are gonna learn from the kids at school. Now, I have another video. I just posted a short about it, but it was, if you don't talk to your kids about sex, they're gonna learn about it at school. They absolutely will. When I taught middle school, them babies, my middle school babies knew I taught life science, and I gave them at the end of the semester, end of the section about biology and sex and all of this stuff. I gave them a card, and I had a tissue box, and I let them put their card with their questions in there, and I pulled them out so it was anonymous and asked the questions. And boy, these kids had questions, but they had some stuff that they thought they knew because they had been talking to each other about it, right? But anyways, race enters the conversation. If you don't lead that conversation with your kids, they're gonna find somebody else to lead that conversation. And the thing is, you don't get to decide as a parent when your kids learn about race. You only get to learn, you only get to decide what they think about it and believe about it, what their core values are, if you have that conversation with them. Now, when you think you're going to wait until kids are ready to have the conversation about race, guess what? It's probably too late already because they don't wait. They have questions. And if you're one of those parents that don't answer your kids' questions, guess what? They're going to find somebody to answer those questions. They get exposed to race very early on. You can't avoid it. You can't protect them from it. You can only lean into it. And I want you to think about for yourself, like, who taught you about race? How old were you when you first noticed the difference between you and other people? If you did, because oftentimes people are in segregated communities until they get to college. I have a friend who's a principal or founding principal of a school called Citizens of the World. I don't think she's still operating in a principal capacity, but when she was, she founded a school called Citizens of the World, and their goal and focus was to make sure that the first time kids are around people of different races and people of different socioeconomic statuses is not when they get to college, but early on. And the school started, I think, at kindergarten or transitional kindergarten, right? But they wanted to make sure that people didn't wait until later on to learn about different backgrounds, people of different backgrounds and cultures and socioeconomic statuses. Because oftentimes, if you're wealthy, you're hanging around other wealthy people. If you are of a certain background, most they say that the most segregated hour is 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday or whatever time church is, right? Because most churches are segregated, usually by race, but also by income. So I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about what you can do instead to lead the conversation. Empower your kids to talk about it. There should be no shame. Regardless of what background your kids come from, there should be no shame. I remember my best friend, who I told you her family's from Trinidad. She was different. Her parents had an accent when they came to school, parent conferences and stuff like that. She didn't have an accent. She has an accent she can tap into as needed, but her regular voice wasn't an accent, right? But people saw that she was different. She would bring in food that was different. She bring in the rice and peas and the curry chicken or whatever. She bring in quality food. While we were all eating chicken nuggets, right? She had quality food, and but kids will make fun of that. But the beautiful part is that at home, her culture was embraced through the music, and then because she was a friendly person and we became best friends in third grade, I would come over to her house for parties. And I remember there was a time where she had callaloo and it's green and it didn't look appetizing to me. Now I love callaloo, but at that time, at 7 or 9 or whatever I was at that time that I came over her house for Thanksgiving dinner or whatever it was, I was like, I'm not eating that. Mm-mm. Right? I'm not. I'm not eating that. She was like, what if I told you I wasn't gonna eat your sweet potatoes? I'm like, more for me, you know. But you live, you learn, you grow up, right? But it's best to have those conversations with your kids. Have the conversation about your own race, ethnicity, heritage. I wish that I still had my grandma here to talk to her about her childhood, to talk to her about growing up and what she had experienced. I believe, and I don't know this, but I believe that my grandmother saw somebody get lynched in Texas because she said, I never want to go back to Texas. Even when I'm dead, I don't want to be buried there. And I said, what could be? And I asked her why. She never would tell me. She said, no, not going to talk about it. I said, why? She wouldn't tell me, right? That's the only thing I could think of that she probably had seen or experienced or witnessed, right? But you want to have those conversations with the kids as soon as you possibly can. I wish that I had my dad here to talk about his time serving in Vietnam in the Air Force, right? But I don't have those stories to listen to now, right? Now I can just imagine and make up for myself what those stories might be like. But start earlier than you're comfortable. If you think I'm going to wait until they start middle school, start sooner. As you start talking to your children or even grandchildren, if you're like me and you're talking to the grandkids, right? Have the conversation about who's in their classrooms. What are the teachers like? Let them define them. Don't push them to be like, is she white? You know, but ask her, what is your teacher like? What does she look like? What is her voice like? What is, what kind of things does she wear? What kind of things does she, and have them start to bring it out and embrace all cultures, right? What if you as a family celebrated all cultures? It's funny because Cinco de Mayo, I always say, is a black holiday. And people are always surprised when I say it, but I love being able to tell people that Cinco de Mayo is a black holiday. Now, hear me out. Um, for those who don't know, the Mexicans were invaded by the French, right? And this was in the 1800s during the time that the Civil War is going on here in America. So, Civil War is going on, North versus South, right? And you have the French who invaded Mexico, this small town called Pueblo, Mexico, right? And I don't know if it's Pueblo or Puebla, but one or the other. And I'm gonna look it up right quick because I don't like not knowing. Um, but in that town, I gotta see if it's Pueblo or Puebla. 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 Um, so in this small town of Puebla, Mexico, the French invaded. The Mexicans whooped them, right? They had to tuck their tails between their legs and head back to France. Well, they were planning on defeating the Mexicans in Puebla, Mexico, and then coming to help the Confederates so that they could, win the Civil War. Now, had they won in Mexico and came to help the Confederates, it might have been just the push that they needed to win the Civil War, and slavery might have extended. I don't think slavery would still have continued to today, but will it have expanded? Would it have extended? I think it would have. So people will say stuff like, oh, Cinco de Mayo, that's not Mexican independence. It's not even something we should be celebrating. Well, it's something that I, as a Black person, celebrate, because if the Mexicans had not beat the French, slavery might have extended, right? And my great great grandparents were slaves. So it's not that far away from me. I was looking at my grandmother's death certificate, and she was born in 1899. When I was looking at going through my ancestry.com, and I'm seeing her dad moved from like North Carolina or South Carolina down to Alabama or something like that, to the deep South. And he was one of like 11 or 12. I was like, oh, that looks like a slave move, because he was a kid and this was in, I think, I can't remember exactly when, but it was during slavery when that move happened. I was like, whoa. So now you get to see slavery is not that far removed from me. My grandmother's father, yes, it's that close. So have those conversations with your kids and let them know that our history doesn't just start at slavery. It goes beyond that. Whether you can trace it back there or not, my ancestry DNA points to West Africa. It points to several parts of Africa, right? And I don't know, but I'm going to have to go back and figure it out. But answer their questions. Lead with your values and not with the fears, regardless. And my heart breaks for people who are being targeted by ICE right now. But have those conversations that make your kids feel proud of their heritage, not ashamed of it because the government doesn't value it, right? Teach them to hold on to the culture, not to hide from it, not to try to cover it up or act like it doesn't exist, right? Teach your kids about the fairness, what's fair for everybody, what's how to be empathetic for people that are going through things, right? It's important that we teach our kids and have those conversations, because they're going to have them with somebody else who may teach them something different, who may teach them hate instead of teaching them love, that may teach them hate instead of empathy, right? It may teach them to not even love themselves in their own culture, right? So you want to make sure that you set that tone for them so that anything that anybody else says is secondary to what you've already stated with them. Now, have that talk with your kids. It's a great time. I was like, man, Christmas was just 2 days ago. And I was like, do I want to have this conversation today? Absolutely, I do. Because kids are going to go back to school in a couple of weeks. And not even, maybe in a week or so, right? Not even a couple of weeks. Kids are going to go back to school. And they may be having these conversations with their peers if you don't have those conversations with them. So I want to encourage you to do that. Please go ahead. And if you have comments, if you have questions, thank you, Trina. If you have comments or questions, let's have the conversation. I love y'all. I appreciate y'all listening to me. I'm on a mission right now. I'm on a mission. And if I could just, man, I've been so immersed in my culture, right? I watched this Eddie Murphy movie, that documentary that's on Netflix. It's called Being Eddie. And he talked about some things that really just sparked my thoughts. But he said, he just talked about, he took a stand for Black folks. He said when he was at the Grammys, matter of fact, I think it's in this notebook right here. If I move some stuff around on this table, I could pull up exactly what because I wrote it down because I'm going to talk about it in another sense. But one of the things that see, listen, that's too much stuff on this table. I got a little bitty table right here. But one of the things that he was talking about was how I'm so disappointed. I don't see it right here. One more page. Nope, it's not in this notebook. But one of the things that he was talking about was that how he was hosting the Grammys, or he was, I think, giving somebody an award or something. And it was in the Black category. And he was like, what time do I have to be there? And they told him, well, you ain't got to be here until like 9, 10 o'clock. It's the last award that we're giving out. And he said, oh, no longer will we be the caboose, right? No longer will Black people be bringing up the end. Like, put some respect on us. And he said, and then I remember him saying this live at the Grammys. He said, but the next day, it was like it never happened. Like it was not in the news. Nobody talked about it. It was like it never happened. But he's also a person who has put his money into the culture. He said, I buried Rick James. I said, what? He buried Red Fox. He said Buckwheat didn't have a tombstone. He put the tombstone on Buckwheat's grave. Wow. When I think about stuff like that, and I was watching a documentary about Dick Gregory and how he was a freedom fighter, and I didn't know him like that. He was a comedian who then went on to really just lead. He was like this with Medgar Evers. He had just left from hanging with Medgar Evers and fighting the good fight to register people to vote and all types of stuff in Mississippi just before Medgar Evers got killed. And I think he had to leave because wife went into labor or something like that. Something happened and he ended up leaving. And when he left, like that next day, Medgar Evers got killed. Crazy, right? But stuff that I didn't know. And I remember my dad used to feed the homeless with Dick Gregory. And my dad was very proud of that. And I was like, I don't know what the big deal is, right? But I wish I had asked more to know what the big deal is. But I'm grateful that they have that documentary out. It was on Paramount Plus. And I tend to go down rabbit holes on documentaries and biographies. But anyways, I'm learning as much as I can about my history, my culture, my people here in America. Harry Belafonte's book, very eye-opening, about his biography. I think it was an autobiography, but I'm not sure if I think he wrote it with somebody else. What's her name? Cicely Tyson. Her autobiography, amazing, right? And then to know Tyler Perry moved her into his house and took care of her until she passed away. Paid her more than she had ever been paid anywhere in any other job for the roles that she had in his movies, right? So I love seeing my culture take care of each other. We all have to take that heart and take care of our people, right? Let's take care of each other. Let's operate with more empathy. Let's have the conversations about race with our kids, with our grandkids, and let's go on and be the best we can be. By the way, I'm Kalisha Washington. I'm your parenting BFF. I help parents plan with purpose so that we can raise kids who are happy, healthy, and whole. Have a great day.